A JudgeMagistR there was.
Greetings everyone, this is JudgeMagistR, and for today's Speedrun 101 episode we're going to be focusing on Aldrnari, the Nourisher of Life. This is the final boss of the game, as well the longest one to finish at both casual and speedrun pace. So with that said, there's lots of speedrun strats to be discussed, so without any further delays, let's jump right into it. This fight is different than the rest. To reach the boss itself you must first face its lackeys, and they are of course the Magma Giants. There are 3 of them and they have no bell sigils. Instead, they have those mandala looking things that needs to be destroyed with the seeds from the flowers that blooms at a great tree. The first giant is the easiest of the bunch, but to make it consistent enough, there are some things that you must know before facing the first giant. As soon as the fight begins, you can grapple almost at anything in front of you. Next, I always recommend to grapple on this spot right here, since anywhere else has very thin hitboxes to grapple onto. From this spot, you can notice the flowers from afar and the first giant punching the ground twice, and that makes 2 of the seeds pop out from the flower. There are 3 of them, and the seeds that pops out are random. Once you glide your way towards the Magma Giant, I recommend using a bow and arrow to pop out the remaining seed, as long of course if they are one of the 2 in front of you. After that, the boss will most likely be charging the shots, and that gives you enough time to strike at the first mandala. For those who played it knows this can be somewhat janky to control, but to avoid missing the shots, the times you should most definitely not strike is when as soon as he shoots the projectiles and also right after you destroy any of the targets. Both animations are way too fast, and even during the bullet time effect and once you shoot it, the game will return to its normal speed where the animation is even faster. This rule applies to all of the Magma Giants. I also recommend aiming more or less at the middle of each mandala, but that will change against the other giants. Now let's talk about the second giant. This one is the single toughest one of them all, and he punishes you the hardest if you miss any other shots. But first you also need to know how to reach the second giant smooth enough. And here's how I do it. When the cutscene ends, equip the grappling hook and aim more or less at the orb over there, but a bit below the orb. Once you grapple there, roll twice on the fire and then jump facing one of the roots. The goal here is to land above the roots and then grapple over that structure over there, which will allow you to skip the puzzle path on the second giant. And next, simply glide forward, which will lead you to the second giant. And once you reach there, the second giant has about 5 seeds of which you can use to destroy the mandalas. However, 2 of them are very away from the others and they are not in good angles to strike them. The ones from the side can be very consistent for the leg mandala, but the others you should use the ones at the front of the boss instead. They also can pop in any order, and sometimes none of them pops at all. There are some alternatives depending on your situation. When none of the seeds pop, you can wait for the boss to attack, which he may drop down one of them. I also recommend the player to bring at least one of the seeds down by themselves. Now if 2 of the seeds pop before you arrive, you can use this one in the back for the leg. Every time a mandala is destroyed, the giant will attack you depending on where you stand. I recommend standing still until the vapor rises from the ground, and then grapple to the next seed. You may have a clear shot for the chest mandala, but that does not happen very often. So I recommend waiting for the boss to return to his idle stance and then strike the chest. As for the head, I personally recommend to aim just a bit below the mandala and not at the middle of it. You may miss it by doing that way, and the explosion from the shots destroy the mandala as well. Now if you missed the shot on the head, I recommend going all the way behind the boss. The reason for this is that after attacking the player, he'll try to shoot the projectiles on your current position, and it just happens that the Magma Giants can destroy the mandalas by themselves. There is a second alternative to defeat this Magma Giant, and it is somewhat related to what you just saw. But before diving into this, I need to talk about how said alternative came to be. It all began when one of the speedrunners from Shadow Colossus named TicTac12 was going through his first playthrough from Praey for the Gods, and this is what happened to him.
I don't know, I'll just go back to a baby because apparently that's the only way. Wait, why is he falling? Why are we... Did I find the skip? Did I do a thing? Did I find the trigger?
This clip was shared among speedrunners and we tried to find some consistency in this. Doing some tests, I realized that the projectiles that he shoots on the player works exactly the same as the one you see in throw, which allows themselves to self-destruct, but I only found consistency doing this when the only mandala remaining was the ones from the head. Later on, another speedrunner named Fuzzles managed to somewhat replicate what Tic Tac did, where the boss self-destruct entirely, but also according to Fuzzles, he shared a fair amount of variance, and sometimes it took much longer than the previous attempt. This variance may be occurring because of two reasons. The first one would be the spot we stand on the route. Getting to this spot is quite tricky, and the character is in constant movement or sliding off from said spot. There is more than a single method to get to this spot, and depending on how he reached to it, the boss may hit or miss the mandalas. The head mandala is the most consistent of the bunch because, in a way, we are standing behind the boss, and the projectiles will most likely explode all over his head. The second reason also comes from the attacks that this giant does or after destroying a specific mandala. This boss has 3 attack variations, and as you see in the screen, the longest one is the most common attack of which this giant does. Now, to remove at least 95% of those inconsistencies, this is what you have to do. When the first giant is destroyed, you'll need to get back to the pool inside the hub area. You could either get back by the stairs or grapple on this tiny blocky pillar, and then next you're gonna be facing the entrance of the hub area, which you can grapple onto. So when you make your way to the pool, all you have to do is simply stand on this tiny bit of root over here until he fully self-destruct. It takes roughly about 21 seconds or more depending on which attack the boss will land after a mandala is destroyed. Big thanks to Fuzzles, by the way, for figuring out the spot where the self-destruct glitch occurs. Also, a brief reminder that the first and the second giant teleport you to a specific checkpoint spot when they are defeated, while the last giant does not have a checkpoint. And speaking of it, you also first need to know how to reach smooth enough. There will be lots of grappling and platforming, so be ready for this. The things I recommend right off the bat is to strike the orbs with the grappling hook from the checkpoint spot. In the meantime the next path is being formed, keep striking the remaining orbs. Now for the next path, you will need to reach a specific destination, which can be reached by grappling more or less by the first orb you strike. Aldrnari will try to attack you, but if you climb on this rocky wall near you, you won't fall over. When any path is being formed, the orbs are always ready to be striked. If you happen to have any special arrows, I recommend shooting more or less on the spot over here to forge another path. If not, you could simply wait for the path to form and then activate from above, and thus revealing the final path. And all you have to do is simply to grapple at the top of that rock. I also recommend grappling at the highest point you can, otherwise it may slide down from it. Once you grapple at the top, there will be another orb to strike right in front of you, and that's where the fight begins. The boss might begin by charging the shots, and if this happens, just wait until the animation ends, and I personally recommend to use the seed from the right to strike said mandala. Once you do it, turn around and grapple at the higher spot behind you. Every time you destroy a mandala on this boss, he will charge another shot again, and if you reached fast enough before or while the giant is charging another shot, I always recommend aiming a bit above the chest mandala. Otherwise you'll possibly miss it. And if you do not worry, because behind you there's another flower that you can strike to pop the seed at the same spot that you are. The seed can be used as a backup, or you could also use for the head mandala. And speaking of the head mandala, there are many seeds of which you can bring it down to strike the head mandala, making this boss the least punishing of them all. Finally, we can make our way to the boss itself. And thanks to a discovery I made a while back, I found a more consistent and easier way to reach it smooth enough. After the cutscene ends, the next path will open, and once it does, I'll recommend to grapple more or less on the spot. Then next, another path will be created. If you grapple at the same spot as I recommended, you can wait at this broken bracelet from the second giant until the path is being formed. Next, grapple to the new forged path, and that's where the magic begins. In the intentional route, the game expects the player to climb our way to the top of the last Magma Giant. However, a while back I discovered that running to the left and crossing halfway through this route instead seems to trigger a mechanic that is supposed to happen when the player is confronting Aldrnari. Said mechanic is a couple of glider boosts found outside of the hub area, which allows the player to glide back to Aldrnari in case you fell down. So instead of climbing to the last Magma Giant, we'll be gliding our way to it. From here, there's two ways of which you can strike the remaining orbs. A beginner-friendly approach will be grappling at the highest platform with the orb, and from there activate the remaining ones. It is not so different than the intentional way of doing it, aside from almost entirely skipping this particular step. Now for advanced method will be striking the orbs while floating in the air. Striking the orbs can be very forgiving due to the slow motion timer, but grappling onto the next platform in front of you may be quite tricky to do it, especially with a gamepad. I recommend to face the camera on said platform and keep your aim steady until you could grapple on it. A brief reminder that you won't have this slow motion effect since it was already used to strike the previous orb. On the final orb, there's also a safer and risky way of striking it. However, this can potentially change on how you'll reach the first bell sigil on Aldrnari. So let's begin with the safer approach. This particular orb will reveal the path with the last orb to trigger Aldrnari. Grapple onto the rocks around the area and wait for Aldrnari where the orb is located. Then Aldrnari will turn around, getting closer to the player. And one thing we must prioritize is to always begin the fight on the sigil all the way in the back. To reveal the sigils, the player must strike some orbs to reveal a new path until the bell sigil reveals itself. On the safer approach, you can do all of this from above because Aldrnari will most likely tilt his body to the side, and from above you could strike the orb below, thus revealing the bell sigil that is located beneath the player. Now for an advanced way to land on Aldrnari would be using one of the gliding boosts. To do this, you must strike the last orb. While mid-air, you have to jump off and strike the orb with the slow motion timer. You have to fall where the second giant checkpoint is located. In the meantime you are falling off, Aldrnari hitbox is activating and the cutscene will spare you from the fall damage as well restoring your stamina. Depending on where you fall, there will be a glider boost most likely in front of you. As soon as Aldrnari is visible, jump and glide and also land on the last sigil at the back, since this method is faster and the player will require to strike the orb from below. And it can be reached fast enough if you jump off from Aldrnari and grapple at the lower platforms. This platform, however, has the most broken collision and sliding off from it can be very frequent. To remove some of the jank in this platform, I always grapple at the bottom edge of said platform, more or less here. Grappling on the edges makes the character climb any platform in a smoother and a much less janky way. But once you activate the bottom orb, you can grapple at the higher spot in front of you that allows you to wait the stamina to replenish while the path is being formed. For this boss, I won't go through the intentional ways of climbing due to how free you can grapple anywhere on the boss as well the platforms. And also the shaking variations are very similar to Draki, including on how to half-cycle the boss as well. So if you're interested to know about these things, check Draki's guide either on the description with the according timestamps or the card at the top corner of the video. But we could still talk about the smooth traversals from this boss. And considering that Aldrnari has no fur whatsoever and is purely made of rocks, which allows the player to grapple almost at any spot. So the more creative you can get with grappling, the faster you can traverse through. With that said, I'll be giving you some tips on what to avoid doing on this boss to increase consistency on your runs. The first and the second sigils are located at the sides of Aldrnari, and climbing your way back to a solid ground for stamina recovery can be rough and somewhat stamina consuming. There are still some alternatives that you could make to quickly get onto a safer spot. The first one would be trying to run when the boss does this lower barrel roll in order to make you fall. But be mindful that the boss can spin on both directions, and depending on where you are on the boss, you won't be able to run through your way on the slower roll. The other shaking animation will be most likely the screen. The screen most of the time makes Aldrnari tilt his body to the side, and that allows pretty much you to stand on the boss, and then you could run your way to the upper levels of Aldrnari. Now for a more advanced method would be using your grapple to grapple onto the other places on the boss. Every time you ring the bell sigil, the boss will spin, and rigging 3 times, especially on easy and story, will give you about 40 to 50% of extra stamina that allows you to, recover just fine. And those 50% extra is just enough for the player to jump back and also use the slow motion feature to grapple somewhere else. But always be mindful of how many stamina do you have, because those techniques can be very stamina consuming and you may fall in the process. Now for the second sigil, which we'll review after striking this orb, go to the opposite direction and grapple onto Aldrnari's fin. You could use this flag as a reference to position yourself and glide below, and once you get there, you may have a clear view of the lower orb, as well the perfect spot to grapple right at the center of the second sigil. If you can't strike the orb with a hook shot from the spot, you could grapple your way there to activate and then get back to the fin by grappling as well. Now to get out of the second sigil consistently, it will probably require the player to freestyle a bit and mash some of the techniques mentioned before, like using the slower roll to get back on top for example, or simply use this moment for stamina regeneration. I also recommend to grapple back at the fin if you want to regain your stamina. This spot in particular though, I don't really recommend to grapple nor stand on it. You'll most definitely slide down and fall. Instead, I recommend grappling a bit above this area, then jump off and grapple at one of the highlighted spots. The second one highlighted however may be inconsistent depending on your distance from it. Now for the first and nearest one, I recommend grappling at the top to stand on it and take a break for your stamina regeneration. Now for the next spot in front of you, you could either grapple or jump down. I also recommend to avoid gliding on this moment so you won't get off track by the wind, and once you land there, you will have 2 options on how to reveal the 3rd sigil. Now, to reveal the 3rd sigil, it requires to strike the orbs, and doing this part in particular with a gamepad can be somewhat frustrating. To increase accuracy, I always recommend striking each of the orbs with the slow motion effect, and since you are aiming and striking while midair, you may have a chance of the player not get affected by Big Al's roar, so you won't get interrupted while aiming. As for the choices I mentioned earlier are related to where you can strike these orbs from. In the footage, you can see that it's even possible to strike before reaching the sigil area, and though this can be faster, it is much more precise and the slow motion effect is highly recommended for this method. Now for a safer and less precise approach would be simply grappling to the sigil area and strike the orbs from there. And once we unbind the sigil, we are finally ready to march onto the last sigil with our big doggo companion. This part is really straightforward, but there are some things to keep in mind still. When the cutscene ends, Aldrnari may be in the middle of a shaking animation. Just run towards the wolf if there's no shaking prompt whatsoever. There's also some unfortunate jank while grabbing the wolf's fur, so I recommend mashing the grab button when jumping onto the wolf. That should hopefully increase the consistency to grab onto the fur. You could also grab by the sides of the wolf instead of the tail. The sides happen to have a larger hitbox to grab on it, and once you climb on it, make sure the character is crouching on the wolf. If the player happens to be standing on it, you end up falling from the wolf, and getting back up will require the player to quickly react with the grappling hook. So if that happens and the wolf is nearer to the last sigil, you can still roll your way back to the wolf, which will also avoid gaining damage over time from the magma parts of Aldrnari. You could also run by the chains, but they can be somewhat slippery though. Well, there was a lot to unpack, but that's a wrap for today's guide, as well for the series. All the bosses and their strats has been covered, and if the community happens to find any massive time save updates on the ILs, I'll make sure to bring them into an extra episode. I may also make some extra episodes on the any % category as well, but for this you should totally check Yusu's guide on GDQ's How to Train Speedrunner series as of now. If you have any other speedrunning related questions to this game, either let me know in the comments or join the Praey for the God speedrunning server, of which you can find in the description down below. I hope everyone is having a great day, and I see you next time.